She didn't choose this valley. She didn't choose this man. And she sure as hell didn't choose to stand in the cold watching her father ride away like he hadn't just sold her future to a stranger with calloused hands and a cabin that smelled like pine sap and smoke. Cora Bellamy was 20 years old, and every plan she'd ever made for herself had just disappeared around a bend in the mountain trail. The man beside her said nothing, didn't reach for her, didn't even look at her the way she'd expected, like property acquired, like a problem solved. He just stood there, watching the tree line, and said, "I'll get your bags." If you've ever been handed a life you didn't ask for, stay with me. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The trail down into Harrow Valley was the kind of descent that made a person feel like the world was swallowing them whole. Cora Bellamy had been on horseback for 11 days. 11 days of mountain passes that narrowed to barely a mule's width, of nights cold enough to freeze the water in her canteen before morning, of her father's back ahead of her on the trail, straight and certain, never once turning around to ask if she was keeping up, or if she was all right, or if, by some miracle, she'd changed her mind about going along quietly. She hadn't changed her mind. She'd never had the chance to make up her mind. That was the whole problem. "There it is," her father said, pulling his horse to a stop at the ridge. Below them, folded into a mountain valley like something tucked away for safekeeping, sat a scattering of buildings, smoke rising from chimneys, a creek cutting through the center of it all. Maybe 40 structures total. A general store, what looked like a smithy, a handful of homesteads fanning out from the center. Beyond the settlement, dense pine forest climbed the surrounding slopes until the trees gave way to bare rock, and then, above that, to sky. It was beautiful, in the way that things that could kill you were often beautiful. "Harrow Valley," her father said, like she'd been asking. Her name was Thomas Bellamy, and he was not a cruel man. Cora had spent years trying to hold on to that truth, when everything else about him frustrated her beyond the point of words. He was not cruel. He was practical in the way that men of his generation often were. Practical in the way that left no room for anything that couldn't be measured or traded or solved. He loved her. She believed that. But his love had always come packaged with decisions she hadn't been asked about, and this was simply the largest of them. He told her 3 weeks ago, the night before they left the Missouri homestead where she'd grown up. "I've arranged something." Those 3 words. She'd been washing dishes, and she'd set down the bowl she was holding very carefully because something in his voice made her want to break it. "Arranged what?" "A marriage. Good man. Honest man. You'll be safe." She'd turned around then. "I don't need you to arrange my safety, Papa. You need something," he'd said, and the quietness of it had been worse than shouting. "The farm is gone, Cora. We can't stay in Missouri, and I can't take you west. My lungs aren't—" He'd stopped, steadied himself. "His name is Grant Holloway. He's been in Harrow Valley 4 years. He's established. He knows the land." "You're giving me to a stranger. I'm making sure you're not alone when I can't—" "Don't!" She hadn't wanted to hear him finish that sentence, didn't want to hear him say out loud what his coughing had been telling her for months, so she'd gone. Not because she agreed, not because she thought it was right, but because the path back to anything else had closed behind her like a door swinging shut, and she was nothing if not a woman who could read the shape of a situation even when she hated it. The descent into Harrow Valley took another 2 hours, and by the time they reached the settlement's main track, the afternoon light was already going orange and thin. Several people came out to watch them pass. Not unfriendly, just curious, the way people were in small places where strangers didn't arrive often. Cora kept her face even. She'd had 11 days of practice. The man waiting outside the general store didn't look like she'd imagined. She wasn't sure what she'd imagined exactly. Something harder, maybe. Something that looked like it was used to taking things. The kind of man her father's generation might call capable in a way that meant good at making other people's decisions for them. Grant Holloway was tall, a few inches over 6 feet, with the kind of lean build that came from actual work rather than anything deliberate about it. Dark hair, a few weeks past a proper cut. A beard that had clearly started as neglect and settled into habit. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat, worn at both elbows, and his boots had seen every kind of weather the mountains could produce. He looked like a man who had spent the last 4 years mostly alone and had made a kind of peace with it. When Thomas drew his horse to a stop, Grant stepped forward and gave a nod that was respectful without being performative. He shook her father's hand briefly, then looked up at Cora. She waited for something, some assessment in his eyes, some catalog of whether she measured up to whatever he'd been told about her. He just looked at her like she was a person standing there. It was disorienting. "Miss Bellamy," he said. His voice was low and plain. "Long ride." "Yes," she said. "There's water heating at the cabin if you want to wash up before supper." It was such a practical thing to say that it caught her completely off guard. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded and reached up to take her horse's reins to tie at the post, and that was the extent of the ceremony. Her father stayed 2 nights. She'd expected longer. She'd wanted longer, if she was honest, even knowing that every hour he delayed was an hour he spent coughing into his sleeve and trying to pretend he wasn't. On the morning of the 3rd day, she walked with him to where his horse was saddled and loaded, and they stood in the early cold not saying the things they should have been saying. "He's a good man," her father said finally. "You keep saying that." "Because I believe it." "You also believed the farm was going to turn around 3 years running before it didn't." Thomas looked at her with the particular expression he had for moments when she'd said something true that he didn't want to acknowledge. Then he pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than she'd expected, and she felt how much thinner he was than he'd been even last winter, felt the way his breathing rattled just slightly at the end of each exhale. "Write to me," she said into his shoulder. "I will. Actually, write. Don't have Mrs. Cord write for you and just sign your name." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I'll write." She stepped back and kept her face right. She'd gotten very good at keeping her face right. She watched him ride out until the tree line took him, and then she turned around and walked back toward the cabin that was apparently her life now. Grant's cabin sat at the eastern edge of the settlement, backed up against a hillside that blocked the worst of the north wind. It was smaller than the Missouri farmhouse, 1 main room with a stove and table and 2 mismatched chairs, a short hallway leading to the single bedroom, a lean-to addition at the back where he stored tools and firewood and the various necessities of a man who lived mostly off the land. The first thing she'd noticed that first evening was that it was cleaner than she'd expected. Not spotless. There was a stack of hides in one corner that smelled like what they were, and the shelf above the stove had accumulated the particular grime that came from years of cooking smoke. But the floor was swept and the windows were clear, and the dishes were stacked in a manner that suggested someone who actually thought about where things went. The first thing she'd learned that first night was that the sleeping arrangement was not what she'd braced herself for. Grant had shown her to the bedroom, small, a wooden bed frame with a decent straw mattress, a blanket chest at the foot, a single window facing east, and said, "This is yours." She'd frowned. "Where will you—" "By the stove." Flat, like it was already decided. "It stays warm enough." "That's the floor. I've slept on worse." He wasn't dismissive about it, just stating a fact. She'd opened her mouth to argue, some instinct firing that said the arrangement was wrong somehow, that she was taking something from him, but the look on his face stopped her. Not challenging, not guilty, just settled. A man who had already thought about this and arrived at a conclusion that wasn't up for renegotiation. "All right," she'd said. "Good night, Miss Bellamy." And he'd closed the bedroom door and left her standing in the small room with her trunk at her feet, more confused than she'd been at any point in the past 3 weeks. She'd expected a lot of things from this arrangement. Cold efficiency, quiet resentment, maybe something worse. She had not expected a man who would hand her the only bedroom and sleep on the floor beside the stove and say goodnight like she was a guest he was trying not to disturb. It made her more uneasy than almost anything else could have. The first week was awkward in the way that living in close quarters with a stranger was always awkward, amplified by the fact that they were supposed to be something to each other that neither of them had exactly chosen. Grant rose before light. She heard him moving around the main room, the stove being fed, the door opening briefly to let in a cold breath of outside air, his boots on the threshold before he left to check traps. By the time she got up and got the coffee going, he'd been gone an hour. He came back around mid-morning, usually with something. A pair of rabbits, once a large grouse. One morning, nothing at all, which he didn't seem bothered by. He'd skin and clean whatever he'd brought without fuss, hang it appropriately, wash up at the basin, and then find work around the cabin or in the small outbuilding. He rarely sat idle. But he didn't fill silence the way some people did, with noise just to prove they were there. Cora cooked. She was good at it. Her mother had made sure of that, and she found that the rhythm of it helped her when everything else felt like standing on uncertain ground. She made what she could with the stores he had and what the settlement's small trading post carried. The first time she put a real supper on the table, Grant ate it with the careful attention of a man who was trying not to show how much he'd missed a home-cooked meal. "It's good," he said. "You don't have to say that. I know." He took another bite. "It's still good." Small conversation. Careful, bounded conversation, like both of them were navigating a room they didn't know well and didn't want to knock anything over. She asked about his trapping routes. He answered without embellishment, practical information about territory and seasons and where the fur ran heavy in certain stretches of the Creek Valley. She told him a little about Missouri, the farm, the way the land had looked before 3 dry summers had broken it. He listened without filling in commentary, which she was starting to understand was not disinterest, but just the way he listened. One evening, near the end of the first week, she asked him directly, "Why did you agree to this?" He was sharpening a knife at the table, the whetstone making a rhythmic sound in the quiet. He didn't stop sharpening. "Your father asked," he said. "That's not a full answer." He set the knife down and looked at her across the table. In the lamplight, his eyes were darker than she'd first thought, brown edging toward something that had no clean color name. "He came through in early summer," Grant said. "Didn't look well. Said he had a daughter in Missouri and the situation was going to close in before winter. Asked if I would consider providing a situation." "A situation," she repeated. "That's what I am." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite apology. "That's what he called it. I didn't think of it that way." "How did you think of it?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I thought of it as a person who needed somewhere that wasn't going to disappear on her." Cora looked at him. He picked up the knife again and went back to the whetstone, and after a minute she got up and washed the supper dishes and didn't push further. But she held that sentence in her mind. A person who needed somewhere that wasn't going to disappear, and turned it over for the rest of the evening. The settlement of Harrow Valley was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, and large enough that a new face could, with some effort, avoid prolonged examination. Cora did not avoid it. She'd decided, somewhere on the mountain descent, that retreating into the cabin and waiting for her life to announce itself was not how she intended to live, whatever this life turned out to be. She began going to the trading post every few days. She introduced herself to the families on neighboring homesteads. She made careful, honest assessments of who seemed worth knowing. The Peralta family, Domingo and his wife Renata, with 3 children ranging from 6 to 12, lived 2 homesteads over and became the first people she genuinely liked. Renata was sharp-tongued and practical in the way of women who'd built something real in hard country, and she talked to Cora like a person rather than like a curiosity. "You're not what I expected," Renata said, the second time Cora came for a visit. They were shelling dried beans at the Peralta table while the children ran some complicated game in the yard outside. "What did you expect?" Renata shrugged. "Most women who come up here through an arrangement, they go one of 2 ways. Either they fold up and just wait for everything to tell them what to do, or they come in swinging like they've got something to prove." "Which am I?" "Neither one yet." Renata looked at her. "That's what I didn't expect." Cora smiled a little. "I'm still figuring out what I'm doing here." "So is every woman who ever came to this valley, the ones who make it figure that out fast." Renata pushed a handful of beans across the table. "Grant's a good man, you know. I know you probably don't know that yet, but he is. Everyone keeps telling me that, because it keeps being true. When Domingo broke his ankle 2 winters back, Grant brought us meat through January. Never asked for anything, never made Domingo feel like he owed something, just showed up with a deer and left." She said it matter-of-factly, like it wasn't remarkable, but her voice had a quality to it that said she hadn't forgotten. Cora didn't say anything. She thought about the bedroom, the floor beside the stove. "Good night, Miss Bellamy." "He's quiet," she said. "Quiet men are easier than loud ones." Renata cracked a hole cleanly in half. "Loud men spend all their noise covering up what they don't want you to see. Quiet men, you actually find out what's there eventually." October arrived with more authority than September had hinted at. The mornings got sharp. The afternoons had a clarity to them that was almost aggressive. Blue sky pressing down against the mountain peaks like a weight. the aspens going gold and then losing their leaves overnight in the first hard wind. The creek ran fuller with snowmelt from above. The animals that would winter over grew visible in ways they hadn't been. Deer at the tree line in the evenings, a bear that Grant spotted and tracked and said was heading for lower country. "Winter comes early here," he told her. It was evening, both of them at the table, her with mending and him with the account he kept in a battered ledger. Furs and trades, and what he was owed and what was owed to him. How early? November, usually. Could be late October if the signs are right. He paused, looking at whatever column he'd been adding. Passes will close a few weeks after the first real snow. She understood what he was saying without him saying it. Once the passes closed, there was no getting out until spring. No letter that could be walked back to Missouri. No changing her mind and riding for somewhere else. Not that she had anywhere else to ride to. "Is there anything we need to do to prepare?" she asked. He looked up from the ledger. She saw something in his expression. Maybe a small recalibration. The recognition that she was asking as someone planning to be here, not as someone waiting to see what happened. "More firewood," he said. "I've got a section of timber I've been planning to work. Could use help stacking if you're willing." "I'm willing." "The root cellar needs a full inventory. I usually put up more preserves in October." He glanced at the shelf where she'd already rearranged his sparse collection of canning jars. "Looks like you've been thinking about that." "Some." "Good." He went back to the ledger. "I have credit at Morrison's store. Get what you think we need." She noticed, without mentioning it, that he'd said we. Sham. She went with him to cut timber 2 days later. It was not a small job. The section of hillside he'd chosen had been dead-standing pine for the better part of a season, dry enough to burn clean, close enough to haul without misery. Grant felled the trees with efficient, economical effort, no wasted motion, the axe finding the same angle on each swing. Cora dragged the cut sections to where she could split them, then stacked them in the long rick he'd laid out the day before. The work was hard in a way she hadn't done in a while. Her hands blistered in the first hour, and she kept working, and by the afternoon she was aching from the shoulder down, but the rick was taking real shape, and there was a particular satisfaction to it that she hadn't expected. Grant came to help her stack in the afternoon, when the felling was done. He worked beside her without commentary on her pace or her method, which she appreciated. At one point she fumbled a heavy piece, and he caught it without making it a thing, just steadied it and set it in place, and she said thank you, and he said and they kept going. By the time the light started going, they'd stacked more than she'd thought was possible in a day. Grant surveyed the rick. "Good work." "You sound surprised." "I'm not." He picked up the axe from where it leaned against a cut stump. "I didn't know what to expect." "That's different." She looked at him. His face was flushed from the cold and the work, and he was looking at the timber rick with the satisfied expression of a man doing his math and finding it came out right. She thought about what Renata had said. Quiet men. You actually find out what's there eventually. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can." "Why haven't you—" She stopped, chose words. "You haven't pushed me about anything. You set up the sleeping arrangement, and you've never said anything about it being permanent. You've never said anything about what you might expect." "I don't expect anything. You're a married man." "Technically," he said, "by whatever that ceremony in front of Morrison and 2 witnesses counts as. That is technically the legal definition." He looked at her then, straight on, the way he sometimes did when he was being careful about saying something right. "I didn't want you to feel like you had to be anything before you knew what you were getting into." He paused. "Before you chose to." "And if I never choose to?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then that's your choice." Something about the plainness of it, the absolute absence of manipulation or performance in how he said it, reached somewhere under her ribs and did something she wasn't prepared for. "Come on," he said, shouldering the axe. "You're going to be stiff tomorrow. Hot supper'll help." She picked up her own tools and followed him back toward the cabin, and she thought about the word choose the whole way home. The end of October brought the first real cold. Not the testing frost of early fall, but the actual arrival of winter announcing itself, temperatures dropping at night to places that made the stars look brittle, the ground hardening to the depth of a hand. Grant was up earlier than usual one morning, And when Cora came out of the bedroom, she found him crouched by the stove, feeding it with a methodical seriousness. "Snow's coming," he said, without looking up. She looked at the window. The sky outside was an odd flat color, not quite gray and not quite white, the kind of sky that looked like it was making up its mind. "Today?" "Tonight. Maybe tomorrow morning." He stood up and dusted ash off his hands. "I need to get up to the Peralta place this morning. Help Domingo close up the gaps in their north wall before it hits." "You'll be all right here?" "Of course," she said. Then, "I can come help." He looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. The Peraltas have been good to me. Do they need more hands?" A small thing happened in his face. Just a small thing, barely there. "Yeah," he said. "They could use more hands." They went up together after breakfast, and the four of them, Grant and Domingo, Cora and Renata, spent the better part of the morning chinked mud and straw into the gaps where the logs had settled and shrunk over summer. It was unglamorous work, cold and messy, the mud stiffening on their hands before they could pack it properly. Renata complained steadily the entire time, in a way that was clearly something she did when she was happy to be working alongside people she liked. And Domingo matched her complaint for complaint, in the particular way of a couple who'd had years to perfect the rhythm. Grant worked steadily and without complaint, which was simply how he worked at everything. But at one point, Cora looked across the wall section they were tackling from opposite sides and caught him watching her with a look she hadn't seen on him before. She couldn't name exactly what it was. Something open, something that wasn't quite guarded the way his face usually was. He looked back at the wall when he noticed her catching it. She thought about it during the walk home, the sky having gone definitively the color of coming snow, and the temperature already dropping into new lows. When they got back to the cabin and Grant went to check on the animals in the lean-to, Cora stood at the window and watched the first flakes come down. Light at first, investigative, like scouts sent ahead of an army. By morning, it would be different. She understood standing there that the valley was closing, that the passes Grant had mentioned would begin to measure their own limits, that whatever Harrow Valley was going to mean to her, whatever this marriage of circumstance was going to become, was going to have to be worked out right here, with winter as the only context. She stood there a while, watching the snow find its purpose. Behind her, she heard Grant come in from the cold, heard him stomp his boots at the threshold, heard the familiar sound of him hanging his coat on the hook by the door. "Wind's picking up," he said. "I can hear it," she said. "Should be a warm enough night inside if we keep the stove fed." She watched a gust take the snow and drive it sideways across the dark outside the glass. "Grant?" "Yeah, I'm glad I came." She hadn't entirely planned to say it, but it was true, in the complicated way that things could be true before you fully understood them. "I mean, I don't know what I'm glad about yet, exactly, but I'm not sorry I'm here." A pause. She kept looking at the window. "I'm not sorry either," he said. She turned around. He was across the room, by the stove, and the firelight made the angles of his face do something complicated. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked down at the stove and began adjusting the damper. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be a working day." She went to bed, and outside the snow came down harder, and the valley settled into winter, and everything that was going to happen between them was still out ahead, undecided, the shape of it as unknown and inevitable as the season itself. The snow that arrived that first night didn't leave. It settled in like a tenant who'd paid rent in advance, layering itself over everything until Harrow Valley looked like a different place entirely. The creek banks buried, the fence lines reduced to suggestions, the surrounding tree line dark against the white, in a way that made the settlement feel smaller and more deliberate. A human decision pressed into a landscape that hadn't particularly asked for it. Cora adapted because that was what she did. She'd grown up in Missouri, where winters were cold but manageable, where you could still get to town when you needed to, where the world didn't simply close around you and say, "This is it now, make do." This was different. This required a specific kind of mental recalibration, an acceptance that the cabin, the settlement, this narrow valley between mountains, that was the whole of it until spring. She was surprised to find that the acceptance came easier than she'd expected. Some of it was the work. There was always work, and the work had its own rhythm that didn't leave room for much spiraling. Feeding the stove through the night, keeping the water from freezing in the basin, cooking in the particular way that winter cooking demanded: heavier, slower, designed to hold heat in the body for hours. She'd taken full inventory of the root cellar in late October and reorganized it with the particular satisfaction of a problem approached methodically. And now she managed their stores with a careful attention that she suspected Grant noticed, even though he didn't comment on it. He noticed things she was learning without necessarily announcing what he'd observed. He'd come in one afternoon from running his trapline in fresh snow, stamping his boots at the door and shedding his outer coat, and he'd stopped at the sight of the drying herbs she'd hung from the ceiling beam, herbs she'd found dried and loose in a tin on the back shelf and put properly in bundles to store better. "My mother used to do that," he said. "It keeps better this way." "I know." He looked at them a moment longer, then moved to the stove to warm his hands. She had them across the whole kitchen. You couldn't walk without hitting one. It was the most he'd said about his family since she'd arrived. She wanted to ask more, and she could feel that wanting, but something in the careful way he'd said it told her he'd offered what he meant to offer, so she let it be. That was another thing she was learning. The difference between his silences. Some of them were just quiet, the comfortable non-speech of a man who didn't generate noise for its own sake. Others had texture to them, a quality of something being held at a measured distance. She'd started to be able to tell which was which, though she couldn't always account for the difference in terms she could easily explain. The trapline was his primary work, and in the deep winter it demanded more from him than she'd initially understood. He was out in all weather, checking sets in conditions that made her cold just watching him leave. Temperature below the point where breath stopped being invisible and became more like smoke, wind with teeth in it, the snow on the ground crust-breaking underfoot to betray every step. He came back some mornings looking tired in a way that wasn't just physical, the cold having worked on something deeper. And on those mornings she made sure there was hot food waiting and didn't ask him to be good company while he ate it. He always said thank you. Sometimes that was all he said for the first hour, but he always said it. One morning in mid-November, she was at the basin washing the breakfast dishes when she heard him come back earlier than usual, and when she turned around, he was carrying something inside his coat, something small and moving. "What is that?" she said. He brought it to the table. It was a fox kit, small enough that she couldn't understand how it had survived the temperature outside, shaking with a fine continuous tremor. "Found it in one of the sets. Mother was caught. She didn't make it. This one was in a hollow nearby." He was already unwrapping it from his coat, checking it over with the careful attention he used for everything. "Too small to release. Too cold." "Is it hurt?" "Doesn't look like it. Just cold and scared." She pulled a rag from the shelf without being asked and held it out. He took it and wrapped the kit loosely, holding it close enough for the warmth. The animal trembled and made a very small sound, and then gradually, over the course of about 10 minutes of both of them sitting at the table doing nothing but watching, it stopped shaking. "You're going to keep it," she said. "Until spring. Then it has to go." He said it with the firmness of a man who had made this kind of decision before and knew the cost of making it halfway. "Gets too comfortable with people, it won't survive out there." "I understand." He glanced at her. "You can name it if you want. Might as well, since you're going to anyway." She looked at the small fox face, sharp-featured and wary even now, amber eyes tracking both of them with the calculating intelligence that foxes seemed born with. "Hazel," she said. Grant looked at the fox. "All right." He set it carefully in a box near the stove with a folded blanket, and Hazel regarded them both from it with an expression of intense skepticism that Cora found entirely relatable. The thing about small spaces and long winters was that they stripped away the performances people put on for each other. There was simply no room to maintain them. Cora had been performing competence for most of her life, capable, organized, fine, always fine, and the performance had become so natural that she'd mostly stopped recognizing it as performance. But somewhere in the 6th week of living in close quarters with a man who seemed constitutionally uninterested in requiring her to be anything she wasn't, some of that automatic armor started to feel unnecessary. She missed her father. She worried about him in the way you worried about people who were far away and not well and couldn't be reached. A low, continuous worry that had nowhere to go. She had written him a letter in late October that had gone out with a trapper heading east before the passes fully closed, and she wouldn't have any answer until spring. That was just the fact of it, but facts didn't stop the worry from being there. One evening, she was sitting by the stove with mending. She wasn't really doing, hands idle, staring at nothing in particular. And Grant came in from doing the evening check on the animals. He looked at her, and he didn't say anything, and he didn't make a performance of not saying anything either. He just got himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. After a while, she said, "I keep thinking about whether he's all right." Grant turned his cup in his hands. "Your father. He shouldn't be alone." She set the mending aside. "He won't say he needs help. He never has. He'll work himself past what he can handle and not tell anyone." She paused. "But there's nothing I can do about it from here, so I don't know why I keep turning it over." "Because that's what you do when you love someone," Grant said. "You keep turning it over even when there's no handle." She looked at him. He said it like a plain fact, something he'd arrived at through experience. "Does that come from somewhere specific?" she asked. A pause. "My father died when I was 19, he said. "I was already away from home. I'd gone west with a trading outfit the spring before. Got the news months after it happened. Spent a long time carrying that. I'm sorry." He shrugged, not dismissively, just acknowledging it. "Point is, the turning it over doesn't mean something's wrong with you. It means you're paying attention." She was quiet for a moment. "When did it stop? For you?" "It didn't entirely." He looked at the stove. "It just got lighter. Took a while." She nodded. That was an honest answer, and she appreciated honest answers more than comfortable ones. They sat with that a while, the fire doing its work, Hazel making small sounds in her box, and it was the closest thing to genuine companionship she'd felt since arriving. "Grant," she said. "Yeah. Thank you for saying that." "It's what's true," he said simply, and got up to put another log on the fire. The settlement's population was perhaps 60 people in a valley that in summer felt spacious enough, and in deep winter felt intimate in a way that pressed everyone into closer knowledge of each other's business. There were 3 families that served as something like the spine of the community: the Peraltas, the Morrisons, who ran the trading post, and an older couple named Hutchins, who had been in the valley longer than anyone, and whose opinion carried weight in proportion to their years there. There was also, on the settlement's western edge, a man named Deaver Skull. Cora had met him at the trading post in late October, before the worst of the snow. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, broad across the shoulders, with the particular kind of easy confidence that came from a lifetime of being the largest person in most rooms. He'd introduced himself to her pleasantly enough, made conversation about the coming winter, said something complimentary about it being nice to have a face like hers in the valley. It was the way he said it. Not quite wrong, but with an edge underneath it, like an assessment being made, that she'd filed away and left there. "Who is Deaver Skull?" she'd asked Grant that evening. Something in his face did a brief, complicated thing. "Skull's been here about 2 years, he said carefully. "He runs some cattle on the western pasture, has a claim on the creek access for his stock." He seemed like he was used to people agreeing with him. "He is." Grant left some space there. "And?" He looked at her. "He and I have had some differences." "About what?" "Mostly about what he thinks belongs to him." He picked up the knife he'd been working with. "He'll be agreeable to you because you're new and because you're my wife. That's the sum of it." She'd thought about pressing, but she could tell he'd reached the edge of what he was going to offer without more specific cause, so she let it sit. She stored it alongside other things she was slowly gathering about the shape of Harrow Valley, the information that places like this always had beneath the surface. Skull came up in conversation again 3 weeks later, in a way she hadn't expected. She was at the Peralta place, helping Renata with laundry, a communal misery in deep winter. When Renata mentioned, with the careful casualness of someone mentioning something important while pretending not to, that Skull had been pushing Morrison at the trading post to change how the water access was allocated come spring. "It's the Eastern families," Renata said, working a shirt against the washboard with the focused violence she brought to all physical work. "His cattle use more water than he's credited for, but he's trying to get the arrangement changed so the creek split favors the western pasture." "Would that affect you?" "Affects everyone on the east side, which is most of the settlement's families." Renata's jaw was set. "He's been working on Morrison for 2 months, quiet-like. Morrison won't decide without community agreement, but Skull has a way of making things seem more settled than they are." "Has anyone pushed back?" Renata glanced at her. Your husband pushed back early on when Skull first started making noise about it. That's where the differences are. She said it with a small, pointed look that told Cora this wasn't new information to anyone but herself. She went home and thought about it, and that evening when Grant came in, she said, Renata told me about the water access situation. He was quiet for a moment, hanging his coat. Renata talks. Renata has 3 children who depend on that water. She kept her voice even. Why didn't you tell me? He turned around. It's something I've been managing. You've been managing it alone. It's what I do. She looked at him, and something in her voice dropped into a register she didn't often use. Not angry exactly, but clear. Grant, I live here. This affects me and the people I've come to know here. I'm not someone you need to protect from information. He was still for a moment. She could see him deciding something. You're right, he said. Not grudgingly, just cleanly. I didn't think... I'm used to handling things myself. I noticed. That's not a criticism of you, it's a habit. I know what it is. I'm asking you to consider breaking it. A pause. Then he sat down at the table and told her everything. The full version, not the abbreviated one he'd offered before. Skull's incremental maneuvering over 2 years, his own confrontation with the man the previous spring, the coldness between them since. Morrison's discomfort at being pressed by 2 sides. The fact that the Eastern family's water security would depend on what got decided before spring arrived, and the creek ran full again. She listened to all of it. We need to talk to Morrison directly, she said, before Skull gets the arrangement framed the way he wants it. I've talked to Morrison. You've talked to Morrison as yourself. Have you talked to him with other families present so he knows it's not just your dispute with Skull? He looked at her across the table. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, but its cousin. No, he said. Then that's where to start. He was quiet for a moment. You've been here 2 months. I've been talking to people, she said. That's what I do. Something appeared at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. I noticed, he said, which was almost, not quite, but almost, a joke. And then he said, all right, let's talk to Morrison. They went the following afternoon. Morrison was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a shopkeeper's careful personality. He disliked conflict, and he disliked making people unhappy, which were sometimes the same thing and sometimes very much not. He received Grant and Cora with visible wariness, the wariness of a man who suspected he was about to have to hold 2 positions at once. Cora let Grant lead, because this was his relationship to manage, and she could tell it needed to stay on ground Morrison was comfortable with. She stayed quiet through the first part of the conversation, watching Morrison's expressions, getting the read on how he operated. It was only when Morrison said, a bit helplessly, that he wasn't sure there was a clear precedent for the allocation dispute, that she said, there's a written record from when the settlement was established. The Eastern families registered their water access with the territorial office 4 years ago. That's the precedent. Both men looked at her. I asked Renata Peralta, she said. She kept a copy of the original registration. Morrison blinked. Skull knows about that record, Grant said slowly. Then he knows his argument doesn't hold up to documentation, Cora said, which might be why he's been working this through conversation rather than anything official. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands with the meditative air of a man making a decision he'd been avoiding. I'll need to see that record, he said finally. I'll have Renata bring it in the morning, Cora said. Walking back through the snow to the cabin, Grant was quiet in the particular way that meant he was processing. She didn't fill the silence. After a while, he said, How did you know Renata had that record? I asked her about everything involving the settlement's history the second time I visited. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind. I didn't know then it would matter. But in places like this, history matters. Another stretch of quiet. Then, that was smart. It was just paying attention. He glanced at her sideways. That almost smile again, and this time it lasted a little longer before he looked forward again. Right, he said. Just paying attention. They got back to the cabin, and he held the door for her because he always held the door, and she ducked inside ahead of him into the warmth, and neither of them said anything more about it. But something had shifted in the particular geometry of how they moved around each other. Cora felt it, and she thought he did too. Latit. December arrived without softening. The temperature on the coldest mornings dropped to places that made the air itself feel like a threat. The kind of cold that had weight and intention, that worked on exposed skin within minutes and got into the joints of people who'd been working outside all day with a persistent, grinding thoroughness. Grant came home some evenings moving stiffly, thawing out by degrees in front of the stove, and she'd started putting a second blanket near the stove before he got back, though she never made a thing of it. He never made a thing of it either. He'd just reach for it when he came in, and once she caught him look at it with an expression she wasn't sure he knew was on his face. Something quiet and almost stricken, the look of a man not quite used to being thought about. She'd turned away before he could see her see it. He got up before 4 in the morning on the worst cold days because traps had to be checked regardless. Because left too long in that temperature, they froze in ways that cost the animal more suffering and the trapper more work. She'd wake briefly at the sound of him moving and then go back to sleep, but she'd started getting up 20 minutes later to get the stove fully fed before he left, so there was enough banked heat to last until he got back. He'd come back one morning in early December and stopped when he smelled the coffee that was still hot on the stove, and she'd seen that same expression flicker across his face before he got it under control. He poured a cup and sat down and didn't say anything for a little while, and then he said, "You don't have to get up for that." "I'm awake anyway," she said, which was not entirely true. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the calm expression she'd developed for moments when she was not going to be argued with about something. He drank his coffee and didn't argue. The evenings were the time she'd come to value most. After supper, when the day's work had been done and the stove was fed, and there was nothing demanding immediate attention, they'd both be at the table, so she with whatever needed reading or mending or writing, he with the ledger or the work of maintaining equipment that the outdoors relentlessly broke down. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't, but the silence had changed character over the weeks, had lost the careful, tentative quality of the early days, and become something more like the silence between people who simply happened to be in the same place and found that comfortable. One evening, he started telling her about a winter 3 years back when a storm had come through and trapped 3 trappers from an outfit passing through. He'd taken them in for 11 days. She listened and asked questions, and he talked more than she'd heard him talk about anything personal. The particular strains of 11 days with 3 strangers in a space barely built for one. The moment they'd run genuinely low on food and had to have a direct conversation about it, the morning the storm broke, and all 4 of them had stood outside in the sudden blue cold just breathing. "Were you glad when they left?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "Yes and no," he said. "The cabin felt strange after, too quiet." She looked at him. "It hadn't felt quiet before they came?" "I was used to it before they came." He looked at the stove. "Then I got unused to it." She understood exactly what he was saying. "Does it feel quiet now?" she asked. A pause. His eyes came back to her. "No," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and then looked back at the letter she'd been writing, and neither of them said anything more about it. But the words stayed in the room all evening like something that had found its place. Outside, the wind worked against the cabin walls, and the temperature fell toward the bottom of what the thermometer could name. And December settled its weight over the valley with the patience of something that knew it had months ahead of it. Inside, the stove did its job, and Hazel the fox slept in her box and occasionally opened one amber eye to inspect the room before closing it again. And the lamp on the table burned down to where Grant wordlessly trimmed the wick without being asked and brought the light back up. These were small things, but Cora had grown up enough to know that small things, accumulated over time, were almost never small. The water access dispute resolved quietly, the way things did when documentation made an argument unnecessary. Renata brought the original registration papers to Morrison's store on a Tuesday morning, and Morrison looked them over with the careful attention of a man reading something that was going to settle his discomfort one way or another. And then he told Skull, when Skull came in that afternoon, that the existing arrangement would stand. Cora wasn't there for that conversation, but Renata was, and she reported back with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had won something without having to throw a punch. Skull had taken it without visible anger, which Renata said worried her more than if he'd made a scene. "Men like that don't lose and move on," she said. "They just change where they're pushing." Cora filed that observation away. What she noticed in the days after was how the settlement's eastern families treated Grant. Not differently. That was the thing. They'd always been respectful of him, always acknowledged what he contributed. But there was a small shift in how they included him in conversations at the trading post, how Domingo stopped by the cabin with no specific reason other than to share a pipe and talk over nothing in particular. Like something had been said without being said. She mentioned it to Grant one evening. He shrugged. Morrison would have gotten there eventually. He might have gotten somewhere different if we hadn't gone in together. Grant was quiet for a moment. Probably, he said, which was as much as he'd give on the subject of whether he'd needed help. She'd take it. December deepened into its worst weeks, the kind of cold that stopped being a weather condition and started being an environment. The only environment, the one everything else had to negotiate with. The creek froze hard enough that the children of the settlement ran across it on a dare, and the ice didn't even complain. The trees on the north slope cracked in the night like rifle shots, the cold splitting wood that had been solid all summer. Frost built up on the inside of the cabin windows if the stove went low, which Cora learned to watch for and prevent with the attentiveness of someone managing a patient with a fever. Grant's trapline contracted in the worst cold, working only the nearest sets, and he spent more time in the cabin than he had in autumn. This could have been awkward, and sometimes was. The two of them in a small space through long, dark days, learning the particular friction of close proximity. He had habits she found irritating, leaving his boots in the exact wrong place, forgetting to latch the root cellar door so it banged in wind. She almost certainly had habits that irritated him, though he never said so specifically, except once about her tendency to rearrange his tool organization in the lean-to without telling him first, which was a fair point, and she acknowledged it. But mostly what they had, those deep December days, was a kind of functional ease that she hadn't expected to find with a stranger in 5 months, and hadn't fully found with some people she'd known for years. He didn't require her to perform. She didn't require him to be more present than he was. They moved around the small space without constant collision, which was partly learned and partly something she suspected had always been there in how they were built. She was thinking about that one morning, about the word built, when Renata came to the door. It wasn't Renata's usual visiting hour, and her face when Cora opened the door told her this wasn't a usual visit. Morrison got a rider through yesterday, Renata said, stepping inside and unwrapping her scarf. Her cheeks were red from the cold and her expression was careful. Before the northern pass closed completely, there was a letter. Cora's stomach dropped. From Missouri. It came addressed to Grant. He's at the store. Morrison sent for him. She paused. I thought you should know before he gets back. Cora sat down at the table, not because her legs had gone weak exactly, but because standing seemed like the wrong thing to be doing. Renata sat across from her and didn't say anything comforting, which was one of the things Cora had come to value about her. She didn't reach for comfort when the situation hadn't resolved itself yet. They sat there for 20 minutes. Cora had her hands flat on the table, and she looked at them, at the calluses that had developed since October, at the way her left thumbnail had a crack in it from a cold week of handling firewood. When she heard Grant's boots on the threshold, she knew from the sound of them, slower than usual, deliberate, before the door opened. He came in, and he looked at her, and his face told her before he said a word. Your father, he said. How bad? He came to the table and sat across from her. He set the letter down but kept his hand on it. He collapsed in late November. A neighbor found him the next morning. He stopped. Let her have a breath. He's alive, Cora, but he can't live alone. The neighbor, a Mrs. Cord, has him at her place, and she says he needs regular care. She let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like 3 minutes. He's alive. He's alive. Grant's voice was steady in the way it was when he was working to keep it that way. The letter took a month to get here, so this is from late November. We don't know how he is now. She absorbed that. There was nothing to do with it except absorb it. Can I get a letter back to him before spring? Not through the mountains. Not until the northern pass opens. He paused. I asked Morrison. There's no reliable route before March. She put her face in her hands, not crying, just needing a moment where the world wasn't directly visible. She heard him get up, and she heard him at the stove, and after a minute he put a mug of hot coffee near her hands and sat back down. And she lifted her face and picked up the mug and held it. I should have pushed him harder, she said. to get someone to stay with him. He kept saying he was fine. He kept saying he was fine because that's what he does, Grant said. You know that. And you couldn't have stayed. I know I couldn't have stayed. She looked at the coffee. That doesn't make it easier to know he was alone. Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. I told him, when he came in the summer, that I didn't think he should push you into the arrangement. His voice was careful, picking words. I told him to give you more time. He said you didn't have more time, that the situation in Missouri was closing in faster than I understood. He paused. He said he needed to know you were somewhere safe before his health got worse. That was the word he used. Safe. She looked up at him. You told him not to push me? I told him it should be your choice. He held her gaze. He wasn't wrong about the practicalities, but it should have been your choice. She sat with that for a long moment. The fire cracked. Hazel stirred in her box and settled again. Outside, the wind moved snow against the cabin wall with a sound like someone brushing a hand across fabric. He was trying to take care of me, she said. I know. And he did a poor job of asking you if you wanted to be taken care of that way. Grant turned his coffee cup. Both are true. She thought about her father's straight back on the trail ahead of her, never turning around. The way he'd hugged her before he left, longer than usual, the rattle in his breathing. She thought about the letter she'd written in October, and how by the time it arrived, he'd already been lying on a neighbor's floor, unable to get up on his own. Thank you, she said, for telling him that. I should have told you I'd told him. Yes, you should have. She said it without heat. It was just true. He nodded, taking it. Another habit, he said. Handling things alone. Working on it. It wasn't quite dry, but it was close enough, and she looked at him across the table, and something shifted, some thin membrane of distance that had still been between them. Not gone, but thinner. I'm going to write the letter anyway, she said, and get it out as soon as the pass opens. First thing, he said. I'll take it myself if I have to. The worst storm of the season arrived in the third week of December without much warning. There were signs, Grant said afterward. He'd read them wrong, or rather had read them as a 3-day storm when they turned out to be the opening statement of something considerably longer. The barometric pressure had done something unusual, a double drop that he hadn't seen before, and the storm that came down from the northern peaks that night wasn't interested in being brief. It snowed for 6 days. Not continuously, not all at the same intensity. There were hours where it lightened and the world went a peculiar dim white that was almost beautiful, and then it would come back harder. The wind was the worst of it. It drove the snow horizontal at its worst, piled drifts against every north-facing surface until the cabin's north wall was buried to the eave, and the sound of it at night was something between a moan and a scream that made sleep difficult. They couldn't go out except when necessary, and necessary was a narrow category. Grant made it to the lean-to twice a day to check the animals. She managed the stove and the water and kept track of what they were burning through. They ate simpler and smaller. This was not a deliberate choice, but a practical one, both of them unconsciously conserving without discussing it. The settlement grew very quiet. There was no visiting, no reason to be outside if you didn't have to be. On the 4th day, Grant checked his stored firewood and told her with the flat calm of a man presenting a logistics problem that they had enough for another 10 days at full burn, maybe 12 if they were careful. After that, the timber rick outside was accessible, but getting to it in this weather would cost more than it saved. We be careful then, she said. We'll let it go down at night, he said. I sleep by the stove anyway. I can manage. She thought about that, about him on the floor beside a stove that wasn't being fed properly through the night, his body working harder to stay warm than it should have to after the days he was already putting in. She didn't say anything yet, but she thought about it. On the 5th night, she woke at some hour past midnight to the sound of him coughing. It was not a dramatic sound, not the kind of coughing that announces something seriously wrong, not the rattling chest sound her father made. It was the dry cough of airways reacting to cold, which told her the stove had gone down more than planned. She lay there for a minute listening, and he coughed again, and then went quiet, and she could hear in the quality of the quiet that he wasn't sleeping. She lay there looking at the ceiling in the dark, and she had a very clear, very calm internal conversation with herself about what she was about to do. and what it meant and what it didn't mean, and whether she was ready, and the answer to that last part was that she didn't entirely know. But she knew that some decisions had to be made before you were completely sure. She got up. She put her wool socks on and her heavy cardigan over her nightgown, and she opened the bedroom door. The main room was cold. Not dangerously cold, but cold in the way that registered immediately on exposed skin. Grant was on his floor setup beside the stove, on his side facing the stove, and he went still when she opened the door, which meant he'd heard her moving and was pretending he hadn't. The stove still had coals, but had gone down to the point where it wasn't radiating much. "Get up," she said. A pause. "Cora, get up and come sleep in the bed. This is not reasonable." "I'm fine. You've been coughing. It's just the cold air." "I know what it is. That's why I'm saying get up." She held the door. "This isn't... I'm not..." She stopped, organized her words. "It doesn't have to be more than sleeping, Grant, but I'm not going to lie in that room with a real mattress and a quilt while you're out here freezing on the floor because you've decided being noble is more important than basic sense." Silence. She could see his back, the way he was thinking. "Come in the room," she said, more quietly. "Please." Another beat of silence. Then he sat up and he ran a hand through his hair, and he got up off the floor with the careful movement of a man who'd gotten cold enough that his joints were arguing about it. He looked at her across the dim room. In the low light from the stove, his face was unreadable, but his eyes were not. "All right," he said. She went back to the bed and moved to the far side and lay down and pulled the quilt up. And a minute later, she heard him lower himself onto the other side, and the mattress adjusted to his weight, and neither of them said anything. The warmth that accumulated between them was simply physical, two bodies in a cold room, the quilt doing its job. She lay on her back looking at the dark ceiling, and she could feel him doing the same, both of them very awake and very aware and very still. "Thank you," he said quietly, like it was harder to say than he expected. "Stop thanking me for basic decency," she said. A pause. "All right." She turned on her side, facing away from him, and pulled the quilt up to her ear. After a while, his breathing evened out, and she thought he might actually be sleeping. And she lay there in the new warmth thinking about her father in Missouri, thinking about the word safe, thinking about how strange and specific and not what she expected this whole thing had become. She fell asleep listening to the storm work against the cabin walls, and it was the best sleep she'd had in weeks. In the morning, the storm had eased to a steady fall rather than an assault, and light was coming through the window at the angle that meant it was later than she usually slept. She reached consciousness gradually and then lay still for a moment, registering that the other side of the bed was empty, which she'd half expected. She could hear him at the stove already, the quiet sounds of a morning being put together. She got up and came out, and he was crouched at the stove feeding it, and when he heard her, he stood up and turned around, and they looked at each other with the particular directness of two people who have moved past a line and are figuring out where they are now. "Coffee's hot," he said. "Thank you." She went to pour a cup and then stood at the window looking out at the snow. The drift against the north wall was extraordinary, nearly up to the roofline. "How much longer, do you think? Another day? Maybe 2. He came to stand near the window as well, not beside her exactly, but close enough. The pressure's shifting. She drank her coffee. He was close enough that she could see the angle of his jaw, the way the gray winter light caught the side of his face. "Grant?" she said. "Yeah. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly." "I'll try." She turned to look at him directly. "When you agreed to this, to the arrangement, did you think it would stay the way it started? Just two people managing a situation?" He met her eyes. "I didn't let myself think much about what it would become." "That's different from what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I didn't think it would stay that way. Because of what you'd been told about me? Or because of what I saw?" he said. "When your father first described the situation, I agreed because it was the right thing to do. When I actually met you..." He stopped, looked at the window. "You're not easy to know, Cora, but you're not hard to see, the way you look at things, the way you don't pretend." He paused again. "No, I didn't think it would stay the way it started." She looked at him for a long moment. Something was happening in her chest that she recognized but hadn't expected to feel this specifically, this concretely, in this small cabin during a snowstorm while wearing wool socks and a cardigan. It was not how she'd imagined this kind of moment, which was maybe why it felt real in a way that imagined moments never did. "I don't know what I'm ready for," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I know, but I'm not. I'm not where I was in October. I'm not the person who got off that horse angry and waiting to be disappointed." She looked down at her coffee cup, then back at him. "I don't know exactly what I am, but I'm not that." He turned from the window to face her fully. His expression was open in a way she hadn't seen before, not the careful, measured openness of a man giving out information he'd decided to share, but something less managed than that. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." She nodded. Outside, the snow came down quiet and steady, and the storm was working its way through its own resolution. And inside the cabin, something was doing the same. Not finished, but no longer at the beginning. She put her cup down on the windowsill and turned to face the room. "I'll make breakfast," she said. "I'll get the animals checked." "When you get back," she said. And it was a small thing, but it meant come back and we'll eat together. And he understood it, and something in his face said so. He put on his coat and his boots and went out into the snow, and she stood at the stove and started the pan and felt the warmth that had accumulated between them still sitting in the room like a presence, like something that had decided to stay. The storm broke on the 7th day. The silence it left behind was extraordinary. The particular silence of a world that had been very loud for a long time and was now gathering itself. The snow lay over everything in a depth that would take most of the remaining winter to diminish, and the cold that followed the storm's departure was sharper and cleaner and somehow easier than the violent cold of the storm itself. The settlement emerged slowly. Doors opened, smoke rose from every chimney. People dug out their front paths and then stood looking at the white landscape with expressions that mixed relief and exhaustion and something that looked a lot like the specific satisfaction of having survived something that hadn't been certain. Cora stood at the front of the cabin with her own shovel and worked the path clear, and Grant worked the lean-to access, and they passed each other twice in the work and exchanged no particular words but a kind of synchrony that had developed without either of them deliberately building it. In the afternoon, Morrison came around to check on the eastern homesteads. He was red-faced from the cold and carrying a list and crossing things off it with the methodical relief of a man accounting for his people. He stopped at their cabin and Cora brought him inside and gave him coffee, and he sat down and said, almost without transition, "Skull lost 2 cattle in the storm. He's going to be looking for someone to blame for how the settlement resources were allocated during the weather." Grant, who'd come in from the lean-to, said nothing. His face said nothing, but Cora saw his jaw settle. "He doesn't have a case," she said. "He doesn't need a case," Morrison said tiredly. "He just needs to make noise." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I'm telling you because I want you prepared. He's going to come at the water arrangement again, and he's going to fold the storm losses into it somehow. He's good at that, folding things together until people lose track of what the original argument was." "Then we don't lose track," Cora said. Morrison looked at her with the expression she'd seen a few times now, a kind of recalibration, a small adjustment to who he understood her to be. "No," he said slowly. "I suppose not." After he left, Grant stood in the middle of the room for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, and then he looked at her. "He's not going to stop," he said. Not worried exactly, more like naming a fact. "No," she agreed. "He's not. It's going to be a longer fight than the water access papers." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to be in the middle of it." She picked up her coffee and looked at him over the rim. "Grant." "Yeah." "Stop saying that." "A beat." "Right," he said, and something in his posture shifted. A small surrender of the habit, the one they'd named twice now. He sat down at the table and pulled the ledger toward him, and she sat down across from him with her letter-writing materials. And they worked in the same space in the quiet way they'd learned, and outside the brilliant cold winter light fell on 7 days of new snow, and made the whole valley look like something that existed at the edge of possible. She wrote the letter to her father, 3 pages, careful and full. She told him she was all right. She told him the valley was hard and not what she'd expected. She told him that the man he'd chosen for her was not the man she'd expected, which she meant as the truest and most complicated thing she could put in a letter. She didn't tell him everything. Some things were still forming, still finding their shape. But she told him enough that he would know, if he was well enough to read it, when the passes opened and she could get it through, that his daughter was somewhere that wasn't going to disappear on her. That was what he'd needed to know. She folded the letter and sealed it and set it by the door where she'd remember it when the path to the northern pass opened. And then she looked across the table at the man who'd given her a bedroom and slept on the floor and told her father it should be her choice, and she thought, he was not what I expected. She was starting to understand that this was the best thing she could say about him. January came in like it had a point to make. The cold that followed the December storm settled into the valley with a permanence that felt almost geological. Not weather anymore, but climate. The mountains having decided that this was simply how things were going to be for a while, and everything living in the valley would have to negotiate with that fact on its own terms. The creek was frozen solid from bank to bank. The snow that had fallen in December compressed under its own weight into a dense pack that wouldn't move until March at the earliest. And on top of that, new snow fell every few days, quiet and businesslike, adding to the depth without ceremony. The cabin had become a different kind of place. Cora noticed it first in small ways, the way she always noticed things. In the way Grant no longer paused slightly before he spoke to her, the way she'd stopped measuring out her words with the caution she'd used in October. They still had their silences, still had the evenings of parallel work at the table that didn't require conversation, but the quality of all of it had shifted. The membrane she'd named to herself in December, that thin remaining distance, had continued to thin. He'd been sleeping in the bedroom since the storm. Neither of them had formalized this, had made a decision about it, or announced a change. It had just continued from that fifth night of the blizzard, as though it had always been the arrangement. He still kept to his side of the bed with a scrupulousness that she found, by turns, respectful and somewhat maddening. But the floor beside the stove remained unoccupied, and that was the part that mattered. She'd started to understand that with Grant, most things happen like that. Not through declared decisions, but through accumulation, through the weight of days building until something was simply true that hadn't been before. One evening in the first week of January, when they'd been at the table for an hour, and the lamp was burning low, and Hazel the fox was doing something suspicious in her box that neither of them had investigated, Grant closed the ledger he'd been working in and said, without preamble, "I want to tell you something." She looked up from the letter she was drafting to send with the spring melt. "When your father came in the summer," he said, "and asked about the arrangement, I didn't say yes right away. You mentioned that. I'm not sure I told you the rest of it." He looked at the ledger's cover, not at her. "I went out to the pass trail and I sat with it for a couple of days. Thought about whether I was the right fit for somebody coming in blind, whether it was fair to ask a person to build something from that kind of start." He paused. "I'd been alone a long time. There are habits you build around that, ways of being that don't account for another person." "You've been working on those," she said. "I have." He finally looked at her. "I'm not fast at it, and I'm going to get it wrong sometimes." "You've gotten it wrong some," she agreed. "So have I." He held her gaze. "The reason I said yes, finally, wasn't because your father needed me to. It was because he said you were the kind of person who fought for things even when the fight was unfair. He said you had good sense and better spine." He stopped. I wanted to know if that was true. And the almost smile, which she had catalogued by now in all its variations. "And it was true," he said, "and then some." She looked at him across the table in the low lamplight, this man with his worn elbow coat and his careful words, and his habit of managing everything alone that he was genuinely imperfectly trying to break. And she thought about all the ways she'd braced herself against him in the beginning, and how that bracing had cost her energy she could have spent on something else. "Grant?" she said. "Yeah." "I'm glad you said yes." He was still for a moment. Something moved through his face. Not the almost smile, but something less guarded than that, something that didn't have a clean category. "So am I," he said. They went back to their work, and the lamp burned down, and outside the January cold pressed against the walls of the cabin and found nowhere to get in. The skull situation developed the way Morrison had predicted, which was to say gradually and with the patience of a man who understood that wearing things down was more reliable than confronting them directly. He began by raising the matter of the storm losses at the informal gathering that happened at Morrison's store most Saturday afternoons through winter. Not accusatorially at first, but as a general topic, a concern for the valley. 2 head of cattle lost was a significant loss. Had the settlement done everything it could to protect the livestock of all its members? He said it in the tone of a reasonable man asking a reasonable question, and the people who didn't know him well nodded along. The second week he refined the argument. The water access arrangement, as it stood, placed undue burden on Western property holders by reducing creek access during summer months when his cattle needed it most. A more equitable arrangement would allow the Western pasture priority access during drought periods. This was, he said, simply about fairness. The third week he started naming names. Grant Holloway had been resistant to reasonable adjustments, he said, because Grant had a personal interest in maintaining his own trapline territory and had used the Eastern family's water documentation as cover for that interest. He was careful about how he said it, careful enough that it wasn't quite a direct accusation, just a shape drawn in the air that people could look at and decide what they saw. Grant heard about it secondhand from Domingo, who was characteristically blunt. He's turning it into a story about you specifically. You should know that. Grant didn't say much in response. Cora, who was there for that conversation, watched his face go through the particular stillness it did when he was deciding not to react visibly to something that was getting to him. When they walked home, she said, "We need to respond to it." "I know. Not you. We." She stepped over a frozen rut in the path. "If it's about you personally, you responding looks like defensiveness. But if I respond, it's different." He looked at her sideways. "You're going to fight my fight." "It's our fight," she said. That's the point." He was quiet for a stride or two. "What are you thinking?" "The next Saturday gathering, I want to ask Skull directly what specific arrangement he's proposing, in front of everyone." She tucked her hands deeper into her coat pockets. "He's been working in generalities because generalities are hard to argue against. Make him be specific, and the Eastern families can respond to the actual proposal instead of the shape of it." Grant thought about that. "He's good on his feet," he said. "He won't be caught flat." "He doesn't have to be caught flat. He just has to be specific." She paused. "Specific things can be answered specifically. That's harder to spin afterward." They walked the rest of the way in silence, but it was the productive kind, both of them working through the same problem from their own angles, which was becoming one of their ways of doing things. That Saturday, Cora went to Morrison's store. She hadn't been to one of these gatherings before. She'd heard about them from Renata, understood them as a combination of information exchange and social event, the kind of thing that served as the settlement's loose governing structure in the absence of anything more formal. About 30 people were there. Not everyone, but a representative spread, including several of the Eastern homestead families, and Deaver Skull standing near the stove, with 2 men who ran small cattle operations on the valley's western edge. She stayed near the back through the first part, listening, letting people notice she was there without making herself an event. Skull did his version of the complaint, slightly more refined than the week before, the narrative about fairness and equitable distribution more polished now. When he paused, she said from where she was standing, "Mr. Skull, what specific reallocation are you proposing?" The room adjusted. Skull looked at her with the look of a man recalibrating. "A seasonal adjustment," he said. "Priority access for Western pasture holders during summer months." "Priority over what? What's the current documented allocation, and what are you asking it to be changed to, specifically?" She kept her voice even and genuinely curious, like she was trying to understand something that hadn't been made clear. Several people nearby, she noticed, leaned in slightly. Skull gave a number. She'd expected this and had spent the previous 2 days with Renata going over the original documentation. "The current arrangement gives Western pasture holders 40% of peak summer flow," she said. "You're asking for 65. That's not a seasonal adjustment. That's a redistribution that reduces the Eastern homestead's summer supply by more than a third." She paused. "I think people should know what the actual number is before they decide how they feel about it." The room was quiet, not hostile. People in small settlements were careful about creating factions, but attentive in a way that was different from the previous weeks. Skull looked at her with a flat expression that had something underneath it she was careful to keep track of. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, with the particular politeness of a man who was deciding how to handle a new variable. I think this is a matter best discussed between the established landholders. I am an established landholder, she said pleasantly. I hold joint claim on the eastern acreage and the water access registered with it. I'm interested in understanding the proposal. Morrison, behind his counter, looked like a man who was very relieved to be behind something solid. The meeting didn't resolve anything, but it changed the shape of the conversation, put numbers into it, made the abstraction concrete, which was all she'd intended. On the walk home, Domingo caught up to them and said almost to himself, "That was something." "She's been something since she got here," Renata said, appearing from Domingo's other side in the manner she had of materializing precisely when commentary was required. Grant walked alongside Cora and said nothing until they were out of earshot of everyone, and then he said, "You knew the numbers ahead of time." "I looked them up." "When?" "2 days ago. When you came home from Domingo's and you went quiet in the way you go quiet when something's bothering you." He looked at her. The cold had put color in his face, and the late afternoon light was the particular pale gold of deep winter, and he was looking at her with an expression she had no remaining pretense of being unmoved by. "You didn't tell me you were preparing for it," he said. "You would have told me not to get involved." A pause. "Probably," he said. "I know your habits," she said. "I'm learning to work around them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, in a different register than his usual even tone, "I don't deserve the way you show up." She stopped walking. He stopped too, a half step ahead, and turned back to look at her. "Don't say that," she said. "It's true. It's not true, and even if it were, it's a bad way to think." She looked at him directly. "You show up too. You've been showing up since October, not perfectly, not without the habit of doing everything alone or forgetting to tell me things, but you show up." She held his gaze. "We show up. That's what this is." He stood in the path in the cold winter light and looked at her for a long moment, and then he closed the distance between them and he kissed her, which was not something either of them had managed yet in all the accumulating weeks, and it was not a graceful first kiss. Her cold nose bumped his chin and she made an undignified sound, and they both pulled back a half inch before trying again. But the second attempt was better, and the snow made no comment. When they pulled apart, she looked at the middle of his coat for a moment, gathering herself, and then up at his face. "Took you long enough," she said. Something crossed his face that she would try to describe to herself later and couldn't quite land on. Some combination of the almost smile and something rawer than that. Something that had been behind the careful face all this time. "Yeah," he said, "it did." They walked the rest of the way home with less space between them than before, which was not nothing. February was the month that taught her what he was made of in the way that nothing else had quite managed. It wasn't a single dramatic thing. It was an accumulation of ordinary ones. It was the morning the Hutchins couple, the oldest residents in the valley, Elias and May, who had built the first permanent structure in Harrow Valley years before anyone else arrived, were found by a neighbor to have run critically low on firewood. Their son was supposed to have come from the territorial settlement to the north before winter, and he hadn't come, and they hadn't told anyone, and they were burning furniture to stay warm. Grant found out from the neighbor at noon and was at the Hutchins place by 2 o'clock with a loaded sled. He made 3 trips that afternoon and then came back the following morning to check the stove and make sure it was drawing right, and the morning after that with a cooked meal that Cora had prepared and sent with him. He didn't mention any of it at Morrison's gathering that week. He didn't mention it at all unless asked directly. Elias Hutchins mentioned it privately to Domingo, and Domingo told Renata, and Renata told Cora with the tone of a woman confirming a theory she'd already held. "He's been doing that the whole time I've known him," Renata said. "Somebody needs something and doesn't say so. He figures it out and does it without making them feel small about needing it." Cora thought about the lamp he trimmed without being asked, the blanket by the stove, the coffee that was always hot when she needed it, the way he'd checked the Peralta's north wall before the first storm without being asked. She thought about how she'd spent the first weeks looking for the catch, for the version of him that matched the thing she'd feared, and how she'd found this instead. Not a man without faults. He was stubborn, and he communicated badly, and he carried things alone past the point of sense, and he had a maddening tendency to think that being capable of handling something meant he should handle it without involving her. But underneath all of that, in the place where character actually lived, he was the kind of man who drove 3 sleds of firewood to an old couple's home and told no one about it. She sat with that for a few days, the way she sat with things that mattered. One evening in mid-February, not a special evening, not a marked occasion, just supper done and the dishes put away and Hazel dozing in her box and the stove doing its good work, she sat down at the table and said, "Tell me about your family." He looked up from the equipment he was maintaining. "What do you want to know?" "Everything you feel like telling me." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he might close off the way he sometimes still did. And then he set down what he was working on and he started talking. He talked for a long time. His father, a carpenter in Pennsylvania who died of an infection from a nail wound when Grant was 19, which was how he'd ended up west. Grief and the need to go somewhere the scenery didn't know his father. His mother, still living in the East, who wrote letters he answered infrequently and felt guilty about. A younger sister named Clara who had married a school teacher in Ohio and who was, he said, the most sensible person he'd ever met besides possibly Cora. He said that last part without looking at her, which made it land harder. He talked about his first 3 years in the mountains, 2 of them with a trapping outfit, learning the trade from a man named Baptiste who spoke 4 languages and played the fiddle badly and had no patience for self-pity in any form. He talked about coming to Harrow Valley and why he'd stayed, which had started as a winter decision and turned into 4 years without him fully accounting for how. "You were lonely," she said. He considered pushing back on this and didn't. "I was," he said. "I'd gotten used to it. Getting used to something isn't the same as being fine with it." "No," she said. "It's not." He looked at her across the table. "You were lonely, too, before this." She hadn't expected the turn. "What makes you say that?" "The way you talked about Missouri, the farm, the way you managed everything there, and still—" He paused, choosing carefully. "Still had no one who knew what you were managing." She looked at the table for a moment. It was a true thing, and it landed with the precision of true things. "Yes," she said. "I was." "Not now?" he asked. She met his eyes. "Not now." Something settled in the room, not the thin remaining distance from December that was gone. Something else. Something that had been built piece by piece from October through the middle of February and was now, in the plain light of an ordinary evening, simply present. Not perfect. Imperfect in the specific ways of 2 imperfect people who had been shaped by hard things and brought those shapes with them. But real, the way only things built from actual material and actual time could be real. D'idée? The last week of February brought something none of them had expected. A rider through the Southern Pass, which was lower and occasionally usable even in winter if the conditions were right and the rider was reckless enough. He was reckless enough. He was also carrying mail. Cora's letter from her father arrived on a Tuesday evening, brought to the cabin by Morrison himself. She took it and held it for a moment before opening it, because the weight of it told her it was multiple pages, which meant he'd been well enough to write. Grant sat across the table and waited without making her feel the waiting. She read it. Her father had recovered enough to be back in his own house by December, helped by Mrs. Cord and her son who lived nearby. He was not well, not the way he'd been before. He acknowledged that plainly, which meant he'd accepted something he'd spent years refusing to accept. He was eating, he was sleeping, he was managed. And then on the 3rd page he said, "I think about whether I did right by you and how I arranged things. I've been thinking about it since the morning I left that valley. If I was wrong in how I went about it, I am sorry for that, Cora. I wasn't trying to take your choice from you. I was trying to make sure you had a future when I couldn't guarantee mine. Whether those are the same thing, I'm not sure anymore." She read that paragraph twice and then set the letter down. "He's all right," she said. "He's back in the house. Mrs. Cord is nearby." Grant let out a breath. "Good." "He apologizes," she said, "for how it was arranged." She looked at the letter. "He says he doesn't know if taking my choice away and trying to give me a future are the same thing." "They're not," Grant said quietly. "No, they're not." She folded the letter along its original creases. "But I think he did the best he understood how to do, and the place he put me in—" She stopped. "It turned out." Grant looked at her steadily. "It did." She put the letter in the box where she kept important papers, next to the water registration documents she'd borrowed from Renata, next to the settlement record of their marriage, next to a pressed aspen leaf she'd picked up on a walk in October without entirely knowing why. She closed the box and set it on the shelf. I'm going to write him back tonight, she said. Use the good paper, Grant said. Top shelf. She looked at him. He'd known where the good paper was this whole time and had never mentioned it. Of course you have good paper, she said. My mother insisted, he said, and the expression on his face was the one he got when he thought about home, complicated and fond. She said if you were going to say something important, you should say it on paper that respected the effort. Cora got the good paper down from the top shelf and sat at the table with the lamp pulled close. Grant worked on his equipment beside her, not talking, just present in the way she'd come to depend on without quite realizing when the depending had started. She wrote to her father for 2 hours. She told him about the valley in winter. She told him about the storm. She told him about the water access fight and how it had gone, and about Renata and Domingo, and about the fox named Hazel who had eaten one of Grant's leather gloves and felt no remorse about it whatsoever. She told him that the man he'd chosen was not what she'd expected, and better than she'd feared, and still not easy to know, but worth the effort. She didn't tell him she'd fallen in love with the man. That was information she was still sitting with herself, turning it over with both hands to find its edges, learning its weight. But she wrote around it in a way that she thought her father, who had known her whole life, would probably understand. She sealed the letter and addressed it. Grant would get it out through the Southern Pass with the next rider, whenever that happened. She looked at the envelope sitting on the table and felt the particular piece of something having been attended to. Not resolved, not finished, but tended. Grant, she said. He looked up. Thank you for the paper. He looked at her for a moment with the look she'd learned by now, the one that said he understood she wasn't only talking about the paper. Any time, he said, and went back to his work. Outside, February ran toward its end. The cold was still absolute, the snow still deep, the mountains still sealed around the valley. But somewhere out ahead, beyond the range of what was visible, March was forming. The season was turning the way seasons did, not by asking anyone's permission, but because the days had accumulated to the point where turning was what came next. Inside the cabin, the lamp burned on. March arrived the way it always did in mountain country. Not as a clean arrival, but as a negotiation. The snow didn't leave so much as it began to argue with itself, the top layers softening in the midday sun and then refreezing overnight into a crust that cracked underfoot in the morning with a sound like breaking crockery. The creek, still frozen at its center, started running dark water at the edges, finding the path that had always been there under the ice. The pine trees along the northern slope shed their snow loads in sudden cascades that sounded like something falling from a great height, and the silence after each one had a different quality than the winter silence, lighter, less absolute. Cora noticed the change before she could have said specifically what it was. Something in the light, maybe. The way it hit the east window at a different angle. The way the mornings, still cold, had a smell to them that winter mornings didn't. Something earthy underneath the cold, something that had been waiting. Grant noticed it too. She could tell because he started checking the northern pass conditions every few days. Not with urgency, but with the attention of a man who was tracking something that mattered. Her letter to her father went out with the first reliable rider in early March, tucked into an oilskin pouch, along with 2 other letters from valley residents who'd been waiting out the winter. She watched the rider head south through the slush and felt the particular feeling of something released. Not the worry, not entirely, but the helplessness of holding it with nowhere to put it. He'll get it within the month, Grant said beside her. If the southern route stays open, it'll stay open. The worst is through. He looked at the mountains. Another 6 weeks and the northern pass will clear. 6 weeks. 6 weeks until the valley was connected again to everything outside it. She'd spent the winter thinking occasionally about what that would mean, whether she'd feel differently, whether the walls of the mountains would feel like they were lifting. She found, standing there in the cold March mud, watching the rider disappear, that she didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. She didn't feel like she'd been waiting. The Skull situation came to its head in the 3rd week of March, and it happened faster than any of them had planned for. Skull had spent February regrouping. He'd stopped bringing the water access argument to the Saturday gatherings. Too many people now knew the documented numbers, and specific arguments were harder to sustain than general ones. So he'd shifted, the way Renata had warned he would, and the new direction was something none of them had fully anticipated. He put in a claim at the Territorial Land Office for an expanded western boundary on his cattle range. The claim, if approved, would absorb the creek-adjacent land that the eastern homesteads used for summer grazing, not their primary claims, but the shared grazing access that several families, including the Peraltas, depended on to run their small operations. Domingo came to tell them on a Tuesday morning with the paper in his hand and his jaw set in the particular way of a man deciding how angry to let himself be. He filed it through the territorial office in the south, Domingo said, went around Morrison entirely. The families on the east side have 60 days to contest before it gets preliminary approval. Grant read the paper. His face did the stillness thing. Cora looked over his shoulder and read it herself. He knew the water argument wasn't going to hold, she said. So he changed what he was taking. Same result, Grant said. Different path. Can it be contested? Domingo asked. Depends on what documentation the eastern families have for the shared grazing access, Cora said. She looked at Grant. Does that access appear in the original settlement records? It was informal, Grant said. Built up over years. Nobody put it in writing because nobody thought they needed to. That's the problem, she said. That's exactly what he was counting on, Domingo said. And he wasn't wrong. They sat with it for a few minutes, the paper on the table between them, Hazel watching from her box with the interested expression of a creature who had opinions she wasn't sharing. Then Cora said, "We need affidavits from every family that has used that grazing access over the past 4 years, sworn statements with dates and descriptions." She looked at Grant. If the access was consistent and relied upon, even informal use can establish prior claim, but it has to be documented now. You know territorial land law? Domingo said. I know that consistent use matters. I spent 2 weeks reading through the settlement records Morrison keeps after the water dispute. She looked at the paper again. We have 60 days. That's enough time if we move immediately. Grant was looking at her with an expression she recognized now, the one that had been recalibrating steadily since October, the one that said he was seeing something he'd already seen but finding new angles to it. All right, he said, tell me what we need. They spent the rest of that week moving through the eastern homesteads, every family that held any claim on the valley's east side. Cora drafted the affidavit template. Grant wrote out to the more remote claims that she couldn't easily reach on foot in the March mud, and Renata organized 3 consecutive evenings at the Peralta table where families came and reviewed and signed. It was not clean work. 2 of the families couldn't account for specific dates and had to reconstruct from memory, which required careful language to make legally defensible without being dishonest. One elderly homesteader named Pratt had used the grazing access for 3 years but kept no records of any kind, and they spent an hour with him going through seasons and events until they'd established enough of a timeline to work with. He signed the affidavit with the slow deliberateness of a man making sure his handwriting was legible for the first time in years. When Cora sent the packet of affidavits south with a rider at the end of March, there were 11 sworn statements, a detailed map of the grazing area annotated with the locations of each family's use, and a cover letter she'd written herself that laid out the prior claim argument in plain, specific language. Morrison read the cover letter before it went out and said, "Where did you learn to write like this?" "I read a lot," she said, "and I'm motivated." He handed it back. "Skull's gonna know it was you." "He already knows it's us," she said. "There's no pretending this is something other than what it is." Morrison looked at her and then at Grant, who was standing near the door with his coat on. "You two make a particular kind of team," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment and wasn't quite an observation. It was somewhere in between, the kind of thing people said when they were slightly in awe of something and didn't know how to name it without sounding like they were gushing. "We're working on it," Grant said, which made Cora look at him because it was the truest thing she'd heard him say in public about what they were to each other. The Territorial Land Office's response came back in 5 weeks rather than 60 days, faster than anyone had expected, which Morrison said meant the documentation had been clear enough to settle the question without extended review. Skull's expanded boundary claim was denied. Prior informal use by multiple established residents, consistently maintained over multiple years, constituted a prior interest that superseded a new claim. The language of the denial was bureaucratic and dry, but what it meant was plain. He'd lost, and he'd lost in a way that was on the official record. He came into Morrison's store the morning the decision arrived, and Cora happened to be there buying flour. She knew by the set of his shoulders as he came through the door that he'd already heard. He looked at her across the store with an expression that had several things in it: anger, and beneath that something that looked like respect, and beneath that the recalculation of a man deciding what to do with a situation that hadn't gone his way. She didn't make a performance of it. She finished paying for her flour and picked up her package, and when she passed him on the way to the door, she said, "Morning, Mr. Skull," in the same tone she'd use for anyone. He said, "Mrs. Holloway." And that was it. She walked home through the March mud and cold and felt the particular exhaustion of a long, sustained effort finally releasing, the kind of tired that was actually close to relief. Grant was at the cabin when she got back, and she set the flour on the shelf and said, "It was denied." He turned from what he was doing. "When?" "Morrison just got the notice. Skull knows." She sat down at the table. "It's done." He crossed the room and sat down across from her, and they looked at each other over the table where they'd spent the whole winter working side by side. And she thought about October, about getting off the horse in the cold, about the bedroom and the floor beside the stove, and good night, Miss Bellamy. And she thought about how you couldn't know, standing at the beginning of something, what the accumulation of days would make of it. "It's done," he said. "He'll find another angle eventually," she said, because she believed that. Men like that don't stop. "No, but the Eastern families know how to document now, and so does Morrison." He paused. "And so does he, for that matter. He knows what he's up against." She nodded. She was tired in the good way, the way that came from doing something that mattered and finishing it. Hazel stirred in her box. The fox had grown considerably since December and would need to go back to the wild when the weather fully turned, which Grant had been preparing for in the quiet way he prepared for difficult things. She watched Hazel stretch one paw out and then retract it and curl back up. "She's going to leave soon," Cora said. "Couple of weeks." Grant looked at the fox. "She's been ranging farther from the box, testing." "You'll miss her." "Some," he said. He said it plainly, without pretending he wouldn't. She looked at him. "Grant." "Yeah, I love you." She said it the way she said most important things, directly, without preamble, because she decided in the last weeks that the habit of waiting until the moment was perfectly right was a habit she didn't want to build. There was no perfectly right moment. There was just the moment you were in, and the courage to say the true thing in it. He was still. The particular stillness that meant he was inside something, not absent, but fully present in a way that had no surface expression yet. Then he said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say that to you for 2 months. You could have just said it." "I know." He looked at her across the table. "I love you, Cora." He said it carefully, like a man setting something valuable down. "I think I've been managing it since around November and doing a bad job of pretending I wasn't." "Around November," she said. "What happened in November?" He thought about it. "The day at Morrison's store, when you brought up the documentation without telling me you'd found it." Something crossed his face, that complicated, fond expression. "I thought, this woman is going to rearrange my entire life, and I'm going to be grateful for every bit of it." She laughed, a real one, not the careful kind. "I did rearrange your tool organization without telling you." "You did. I've made my peace with it." He reached across the table and she put her hand in his, and they sat like that in the bright, cold March afternoon light. And it was not a perfect moment, because perfect moments were a fiction, and they'd both stopped believing in fiction sometime around December. It was a real one, which was considerably better. Spring broke over Harrow Valley like something that had been held back too long and finally let go. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in the way that meaningful things happened. In accumulation, in increments, each day adding to the last, until one morning you walked outside and the world was genuinely different, and you couldn't name the exact morning it had changed because it had been changing the whole time. The creek came back first, cracking through its ice in sections until the whole length of it was running full and cold and loud in a way that Cora found she'd missed without knowing she was missing it. The mud was extraordinary. The valley floor, frozen solid for 4 months, gave up its frost in a slow upheaval that made every path an obstacle. Grant lost a boot to it one morning, pulling his foot out of a sucking stretch of the track, and stood there on one sock in the cold with the particular expression of a man who had decided this was not going to ruin his day, and Cora had laughed until she had to sit down. And he'd looked at her with the boot in his hand and then started laughing too, which was the best sound she'd heard in months. The aspens at the valley's edge put out their first tentative leaves in pale green, almost silver in the morning light. Birds that had been absent all winter came back in populations that seemed to Cora excessive and wonderful after the quiet months. The noise of them in the mornings was almost startling, a reminder that the world outside the valley had been going on all this time. Her father's response letter came in the second week of April. He was better. Not well. He was honest about that, and so was she, reading between his lines. But better. He'd hired a man from the neighboring farm to help through the season. Mrs. Cord checked on him twice a week. He was eating, he said, though she suspected that meant he was eating when reminded. He said, "I read what you wrote about the man 3 times. I think I understand what you're telling me, even the parts you didn't say directly. I am glad. I want you to know that I am glad, even knowing I went about it all wrong. Your mother always said I was better at deciding than asking. She was right about most things. She read that part to Grant in the evening, and he listened without comment, and then said, 'He sounds like a man who's gotten honest with himself.' He does," she said. "It took a while. It usually does." She looked at him. "Is that from experience?" "Some." He was quiet for a moment. "I spent a few years being honest with everyone except myself, telling myself I preferred being alone because the alternative was easier than admitting the alternative scared me." "What scared you about it?" He considered that with the seriousness he gave most real questions. "Needing someone," he said, "organizing your life around a person, and then having that person—" He paused. "Things go wrong. People leave. I'd seen enough of that to think maybe it was simpler not to need anyone in the first place. And now?" He looked at her directly. "Now I think I was wrong. Simple isn't the same as good. Lonely isn't the same as safe." He paused. "You can't protect yourself from loss by deciding not to have anything worth losing. All you do is guarantee the loss before it happens." She held that in her hands for a moment, the weight of it. "Your father," she said. "My father," he agreed, "and a few other things along the way." She got up from her chair and went around the table and sat beside him rather than across from him, and he shifted to accommodate this without making a thing of it. And they sat with the letter between them and the evening coming down outside and the spring sounds coming through the walls. And she thought, this is what I didn't know I was looking for. Not the security her father had been trying to arrange for her, not safety in the sense of nothing bad ever happening. Something else. Someone to sit beside when the letters came. Someone who said the true thing instead of the comfortable thing. Someone whose silences she'd learned to read, and whose hands she knew, and whose habits drove her crazy in specific ways that had become, without her fully authorizing it, a form of affection. Hazel left on a morning in late April. Grant had been leaving the cabin door open longer and longer in the mild mornings, and the fox had been ranging farther each time, testing the boundary between the known and the not known in the way that young wild things did when they were almost ready. On that morning, she went out the door after breakfast and didn't come back. They waited. Grant went to the door twice to look. "She's gone," he said the second time. Cora came and stood beside him in the doorway. The morning was bright and cold, and the ground was damp from a night rain, and there was no fox visible in any direction. "She'll be all right," Cora said. "She'll be all right," Grant agreed. He didn't move from the doorway immediately. She watched him look at the place near the tree line where Hazel had last been heading, and she thought about the fox kit in his coat back in November, the careful way he'd wrapped it, the 10 minutes of both of them sitting at the table doing nothing but watching it stop shaking. She thought about the deer he'd brought to the Peraltas when Domingo broke his ankle, the firewood for the Hutchins, the boot in the mud, the almost smile. "Hey," she said. He looked at her. "She was always going to leave. That was always the point." "I know." "You did right by her," she said. "That's the whole thing sometimes. You do right by something and then you let it go." He looked at her for a moment with the open expression he had when something landed. "Yeah," he said, "that's the whole thing." They stood in the doorway a little longer, and then he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and neither of them said anything. And the morning went on being what it was, bright and new and indifferent to the small human grief of it, the way mornings were. The settlement held a gathering in May that wasn't one of the regular Saturday affairs, but something more deliberate, the kind of event that small communities organized when they needed to mark something. It was partly a celebration of winter's end. That was always worth marking in mountain country, the survival of another season. It was partly about the water and grazing decisions, the settlement's sense of having held its ground against something that had been trying to chip away at it. Morrison organized it, which meant it happened at the right time and with enough food for twice as many people as attended. Cora stood in the afternoon sunlight outside Morrison's store with Grant beside her and Renata on her other side, and she looked at the valley, the green coming back into it, the creek flashing, the mountains still carrying their upper snowpack, but the lower slopes emerging, the aspens in full leaf now and moving in the light breeze, and she thought about the woman who had ridden down into this valley the previous October, angry and realistic and braced for disappointment. That woman had not been wrong to brace. Life did not stop requiring bracing just because you'd found something good in it. Skull was still in the valley. Her father's health was still uncertain. The winters would keep coming. Things would keep breaking and needing to be fixed. People would still make decisions for each other with the best intentions and the worst methods. All of that was still true, but she was not the same person who had come over the ridge. She had learned the difference between a man's silence and his absence. She had learned that fighting for something alongside someone was different in kind, not just degree, from fighting alone. She had learned that the thing you didn't choose could become the thing that chose you, and that the second kind of choosing, the deliberate kind, the one you made with full information after months of accumulating evidence, was more solid than anything arranged in advance had ever been. Renata came and stood beside her and said, looking out at the same valley, "You look different than you did in October." "Do I?" "Settled," Renata said. "Not sentimental about it, just observational. Like someone who decided to actually be here." "I decided somewhere around December," Cora said. "Give or take." Renata glanced at Grant, who was across the yard talking with Domingo and Elias Hutchins. "He's been decided since the beginning," she said. "Just didn't know how to say it to you." "He figured it out eventually." "They usually do," Renata said. "The slow ones are just being thorough." Cora laughed, and across the yard Grant heard it and looked over. And she met his eyes, and he held her gaze for a moment with the look that was no longer the almost smile, but the real thing. And then Domingo said something, and he looked back, and Cora looked back at the mountains. Elias Hutchins made a small speech that nobody had asked him to make, but that everyone was glad to hear, because he'd been in the valley longer than anyone, and his speeches were short and specific, and he didn't waste words on ceremony. He said that what held communities together in hard country was not resources or location, but the particular willingness of its people to show up for each other without making a ledger of it. He said he'd seen communities that had more than Harrow Valley fail, and communities with less survive, and the difference was always the same. You showed up, you did the thing, you didn't wait to be asked. He sat down to more applause than a short speech usually got, and Morrison, who was constitutionally uncomfortable with sentiment, immediately started passing around food, which was the right thing to do. Grant came to stand beside her afterward, close enough that their arms touched, and said quietly, "Hutchins looked at you when he said the part about showing up without making a ledger." "He looked at both of us," she said. "He looked at you first." She looked up at him. "Does that bother you?" "No," he said. "He's right." He paused. "You came here with nothing you'd chosen, and you built something anyway. You didn't wait for it to get easier, you just worked with what was in front of you." She was quiet for a moment. "You gave me something to work with," she said. "That's not a small thing. You could have been different." "I could have," he said, without false modesty about it. "You weren't." "I wasn't." He looked at the valley, the mountains, the creek catching light. "Neither were you." There was a particular kind of understanding that passed between people who had been through something together. Not a thing you could describe easily from the outside. Not a thing that required explaining from the inside. It was in the shorthand that developed between them, in the way she knew which of his silences meant he was working something out, and which meant he was tired, in the way he knew to put coffee on when she had her letter-writing face, and to leave her alone when she had the other kind. It was in all the small, invisible architecture of two lives that had been built in proximity to each other, and were now, undeniably and without making a ceremony of it, built together. This was not a perfect love story. It had started wrong, with a decision made for her by someone who loved her and understood her less than he believed. It had been full of miscommunication and withheld information and habits built around solitude that didn't surrender easily. There had been real cold and real fear, and a man sleeping on a floor beside a stove for longer than he should have because he was trying to do right by a woman he didn't know yet. But that was the thing about love that earned itself rather than simply arrived. It had the particular density of things actually made. Not given, not arranged, not declared into existence. Made from the materials available by two imperfect people who kept showing up. The winter that came the following year found the cabin changed. Grant had built an addition off the eastern wall through the summer. Nothing elaborate, just a second room, built properly this time with good lumber and tight chinking, because he had help, because Domingo and two other men from the settlement came to frame it, and because Cora had opinions about the window placement that turned out to be correct. The addition had taken them the better part of August, and there had been 2 days in the middle of it where the project looked like it might go sideways. And they'd had a real argument about the roofline that ended with Cora being right and Grant admitting it with the specific grace of a man who genuinely stopped keeping score. In November, when the first snow came, Cora was in that addition in the late afternoon when Grant came in from checking the eastern trapline, cold and tired, and stopped in the doorway of the new room. The light was going outside, and it came through the window she'd specified at the angle she'd known it would, low and golden, and she was sitting in it with their daughter against her shoulder. The baby was 6 weeks old and had, in those 6 weeks, expressed a comprehensive opinion about being put down, which meant she was almost constantly being held. She was sleeping now, which was not something that happened reliably enough that it should be taken for granted, so Cora was sitting very still in the window light, not doing anything that might constitute motion. Grant stood in the doorway and looked at the two of them in the same way he looked at things that mattered to him, without performing the looking, without making it a declaration. He just looked. "How long has she been down?" he said quietly. 20 minutes. Don't breathe loud." He came into the room carefully, pulling off his coat as he came, and he sat in the second chair that had arrived in the room from somewhere during the first week of the baby's life, and that neither of them had specifically acquired, the way things sometimes appeared in a household that needed them. He smelled like cold air and pine, and the outdoors he'd spent all day in, and he looked at his daughter's sleeping face with the expression he'd had from the first hour he'd held her. Slightly awed, slightly frightened, completely committed. "Hard day?" Cora asked. "Average." He looked at the window. "Peralta's north fence came down in last night's wind. We got it back up this afternoon." "Did you ask for help, or did Domingo just show up?" A pause. "Domingo showed up." She looked at him over the baby's head. He met her eyes with the expression of a man acknowledging a recurring point. "I was going to go ask," he said. "Of course you were." "I was." "Grant." "Next time," he said. "I'll ask next time." She looked at him for a moment, this man she'd learned over a year of seasons. This man with his elbow-worn coat and his specific stubbornness and his invisible kindnesses and his love that didn't announce itself but showed up every morning, consistently, in small ways that added up to everything. She shifted the baby slightly and held her hand out, and he took it across the space between their chairs, the grip easy and familiar, the warmth of it as known as the cabin walls. "You'll get there," she said. "Working on it," he said. And outside, the second winter settled over Harrow Valley, over the frozen creek and the buried fence lines and the pine slopes going dark in the early dark. And inside the lamp was lit, and the stove was fed, and the baby breathed her small, steady breaths in the still room. The mountains didn't care what happened inside the valley. They had been there before any of it, and would be there long after. But inside the warm room, in the particular life that two people had built from an arrangement neither of them had chosen, something had taken root that the mountains in all their indifference couldn't touch. Some things you choose. Some things choose you. The ones that last are usually the ones you then choose again, every day, on purpose, with full knowledge of what you're doing and what it costs and why it's worth it anyway. Cora Holloway had learned that in a mountain valley over the course of one winter, and she carried it forward into every season that came after. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.